She heard it through the dining room wall. The wall between the small parlor and the dining room at Ashworth Hall was not thick. It had been built in the last century by a duke who valued symmetry over substance, and the plaster was thin enough that sound passed through it the way light passes through muslin, not clearly, not completely, but enough. Enough to hear the clink of glasses, enough to hear the particular cadence of the dowager's voice when she was making a point she considered irrefutable. Enough to hear, with absolute clarity, the 5 words that the Duke of Ashworth spoke to his mother on a Tuesday evening in November, 3 months after his wedding. "She is nothing to me." Helena Ashworth, Helena Morley, as she had been before the ring and the register and the chapel and the breakfast, where 40 guests had drunk to her health while her husband looked at a point above her head, stood in the small parlor with a book she had been reading and a cup of tea she had been drinking and a life she had been trying, with considerable effort and diminishing success, to build. Oh, and she heard her husband say the words that confirmed what she had suspected since the wedding night, that she was furniture. Expensive, well-chosen, appropriately positioned furniture, selected by his mother for compatibility with the existing arrangement, and installed in the house with the same care one might give to a sideboard, ensuring it was level, ensuring it did not clash with the wallpaper, and then forgetting about it entirely. She set down the book. She set down the tea. She stood very still for a moment, in the way that people stand still when the ground has shifted beneath them, and they are waiting to see whether it will settle or open, and then she did something that surprised even herself. She did not cry. She did not storm into the dining room and confront him. She did not pack a trunk or write to her father or collapse onto the settee with the theatrical devastation that the moment might have warranted. She walked to the writing desk in the corner of the parlor, sat down, and began making a list. The list was practical. It contained the following items: the household accounts, which the dowager currently controlled, the tenants on the northern estate, whom Helena had not yet been permitted to visit, the library, which contained 400 volumes she had not yet catalogued, the kitchen garden, which had been neglected since the previous duchess's death, and the morning room on the east side of the house, which received the best light and which no one used because the dowager preferred the west-facing drawing room. Helena looked at the list. She added one more item at the bottom: the connecting door. Then she stood, walked to the bedchamber she shared with her husband, shared in the loosest possible sense. He slept there. She slept there. They occupied the same room the way 2 books occupy the same shelf, present but unrelated, and she locked the connecting door from her side. The lock made a sound, a small, definitive click. The sound of a woman who had heard what she needed to hear and had decided, with the quiet precision that would come to define everything she did from that moment forward, that she would build a life that did not require him. Not as punishment, not as strategy, simply as fact. If she was nothing to him, then she would need nothing from him, and she would begin immediately. The dowager had chosen Helena for the same reasons dowagers always chose: compliance, background, and the absence of any quality that might threaten the existing order. Helena was the second daughter of Viscount Morley, a family of adequate rank and inadequate funds, whose estate in Hampshire produced enough income to maintain appearances and not a shilling more. She was 23. She was pretty in a composed, undemanding way, fair-haired, slender, with the kind of face that people described as pleasant when they could not think of anything more specific to say. She played the pianoforte. She watercolored. She'd been educated to the precise degree that made a woman conversational without making her argumentative, and she had accepted the Duke's proposal, delivered through her father, without a private word exchanged between them, because her father had told her it was the best she could hope for, and she had believed him because she had been taught to believe her father the way she had been taught to curtsy, automatically, completely, and without examining the mechanism. The Duke of Ashworth was 31. His name was Edmund. He was tall, dark-haired, serious in the way that men are serious when they have inherited responsibility too young and have never learned to set it down. He had been Duke since he was 23, when his father had died of a stroke in the House of Lords, literally in the chamber, mid-sentence during a debate on the Corn Laws, and he had spent the subsequent 8 years managing the estate, attending the Lords with the grim regularity of a man honoring a death, and allowing his mother to manage everything else. Everything else included: the household, the social calendar, the servants, the menus, the correspondence, the tenants, and, as of 3 months ago, his wife. Edmund had not chosen Helena. His mother had chosen Helena. Edmund had agreed to the choice the way he agreed to most of his mother's decisions, with the exhausted compliance of a man who had discovered, over 8 years, that resistance required more energy than surrender and produced worse results. His mother was formidable. His mother was relentless. His mother was, in the particular way of women who have lost their husbands and redirected their entire emotional capacity toward their sons, impossible to refuse without inflicting a wound that Edmund was not willing to inflict. So he had married Helena. He had stood in the chapel and said the words and signed the register, and taken her hand. Her hand had been cold, he remembered that, and he had brought her to Ashworth Hall and installed her in the rooms his mother had selected and sat across from her at breakfast every morning for 3 months. And he had not once, in all that time, asked her a single question about herself that was not related to the management of the household. He had said, "She is nothing to me," to his mother, because his mother had asked over dinner whether Helena was becoming a distraction, by which she meant, "Is your wife developing opinions? Is she asking questions? Is she showing signs of becoming a person rather than a fixture?" And Edmund, who was tired and who had been reading a state report since 6 o'clock that morning, and who wanted the conversation to end so he could return to his study, had said the thing that would make his mother stop asking. He had not meant it. Or rather, he had meant it in the way that a man who has never looked at something means it when he says it is not worth looking at. He had not examined his wife. He had not attempted to know her. He had treated her the way his mother treated the household silver, maintained, displayed, and never actually used. "She is nothing to me," was not a judgment. It was a confession of neglect so complete that he had mistaken it for indifference. He did not know she had heard. Helena began the next morning. She rose at 6 and an hour before the household, and walked the kitchen garden in the gray November light. The garden had not been tended properly in years. The beds were overgrown, the paths unclear, the herb borders tangled into an undifferentiated mass that a gardener had been trimming into submission rather than managing with purpose. Helena walked every row. She knelt in the cold earth and identified what was growing: rosemary, thyme, sage, lavender gone woody, a patch of mint that had colonized an entire bed. She made notes in the leather notebook she had begun carrying everywhere. At 7, she went to the morning room on the east side. It had been closed, the furniture under sheets, the curtains drawn, but the light, when she pulled back the curtains, was extraordinary. Pale winter morning light, clear and cold and honest, the kind of light that did not flatter but revealed, and Helena stood in it and thought, "This is mine now." She asked Mrs. Paget, the housekeeper, to have the room opened and cleaned. Mrs. Paget, who had served the household for 16 years and who operated under the Dowager's authority with the careful obedience of a woman who understood where power resided, hesitated. "The Dowager prefers the west drawing room, Your Grace." "The Dowager is welcome to the west drawing room. I should like the east morning room. It has better light." "I will need to consult—" "You do not need to consult anyone. I am the Duchess. This is my household. Please have the room opened by noon." Mrs. Paget looked at Helena with the expression of a woman revising an assessment she had made 3 months ago and found wanting. She had dismissed the new Duchess as another of the Dowager's selections, pleasant, compliant, forgettable. The woman standing before her in the gray morning light with dirt on her hands from the kitchen garden and a notebook under her arm was not forgettable. "By noon, Your Grace," Mrs. Paget said. Helena took the morning room. She took the kitchen garden. She took the household accounts, not by asking, but by requesting the ledgers from Blackwell the steward and reviewing them at the desk she had installed in the morning room in the cold, honest light with the precision of a woman who had been raised in a household where money was counted carefully because there was never enough of it. She found inefficiencies. She always found inefficiencies. It was, she was discovering, a talent she had not known she possessed because no one had ever given her anything to apply it to. The coal supplier was charging above market rate. The linen rotation had not been updated in 6 years. The tenants on the northern boundary had submitted 3 repair requests that had been filed and forgotten. She fixed them. She wrote to the coal supplier and negotiated a lower rate. She reorganized the linen rotation with Mrs. Paget, who had gone from reluctant compliance to active collaboration within a week. She visited the northern tenants personally, in the Dowager's carriage, a small act of territorial assertion that the Dowager noticed and did not comment on, which was itself a form of comment. The dowager noticed all of it. She noticed the morning room. She noticed the kitchen garden. She noticed the household accounts, which had been her domain for 8 years and which were now, quietly and irreversibly, no longer hers. She noticed that Helena rose at 6 and walked the garden and sat at her desk by 7 and managed the house with a competence that the dowager had not anticipated and could not, without appearing petty, object to. She said to Edmund, over luncheon, "Your wife has taken the morning room." "Has she?" "She has reorganized the linen rotation." "I see." "She visited the northern tenants yesterday, without informing me." Edmund looked up from his plate. He had been eating mechanically, the way he did everything at meals, with the distracted efficiency of a man whose mind was elsewhere, and for the first time, something his mother said about Helena registered as information rather than noise. "She visited the tenants?" "In my carriage. She brought preserves from the kitchen. She promised the Hendersons that their roof would be repaired before Christmas." "Will it?" "She has already spoken to Blackwell about it. He tells me the work will begin next week." Huh? Edmund sat with this. His wife, the woman he had described as nothing 3 weeks ago, had visited tenants he had not visited in months, identified a repair he had not actioned in a year, and arranged for the work to begin within a week. She had done this without asking him, without informing him, without requiring anything from him at all. He noticed for the first time that the connecting door had been locked. He did not try the handle that night. He had not tried the handle any night. Their marriage had been, from the beginning, conducted with the mechanical duty that both of them had been raised to consider sufficient. But he noticed that the door was locked, and noticing it produced a sensation he had not expected. Not irritation, not offense, but curiosity. The lock was new. The lock meant something. The lock was a decision made by a woman he had not credited with the capacity for decisions. He began watching her. Not deliberately, not the way he watched the estate accounts or the proceedings in the Lords, but with the peripheral, almost involuntary, attention of a man who has noticed that a piece of furniture he had been ignoring has begun to move. She was at the desk in the morning room by 7 every day. She walked the kitchen garden in the dawn. She met with Mrs. Paget and Blackwell, and the head gardener and the cook, and she conducted these meetings with a calm, precise authority that bore no resemblance to the pleasant, compliant woman who had sat across from him at breakfast for 3 months, saying nothing. She still said nothing at breakfast. That had not changed. She sat at the far end of the table and drank her tea and ate her toast and read her notebook, and she did not speak to him unless he spoke first, and he did not speak first because he had never spoken first, and the habit was so deeply established that breaking it felt like breaking a physical object. But she was different. The silence was different. 3 months ago, her silence had been the absence of speech, the quiet of a woman who had nothing to say, or who believed her speech was unwelcome. Now her silence was the presence of choice. She was not failing to speak, she was choosing not to. And the difference, once Edmund saw it, was impossible to unsee. On a Thursday in December, 5 weeks after the wall, Edmund came home from the House of Lords to find the morning room lit and occupied. Helena was at her desk. Blackwell was beside her, pointing to something in the estate ledger. They were discussing the drainage on the southern field, a problem Edmund had been aware of for 2 years and had delegated to Blackwell without resolution. He stood in the doorway and listened. Helena was proposing a solution, rerouting the channel through the existing ditch line rather than digging a new one, which would halve the cost and could be completed before the spring planting. Blackwell was nodding. Blackwell, who had served 3 dukes and who deferred to no one except the man who paid his salary, was nodding at Helena's drainage proposal with the expression of a man who had just been shown something obvious and was embarrassed not to have seen it himself. "That's a good solution," Edmund said from the doorway. Helena looked up. Her expression did not change. The composed, pleasant mask remained exactly where it had been since the wedding. But her eyes moved to his face and stayed there for a moment longer than usual, with a quality he could not immediately identify. Not warmth, not coldness, assessment. She was measuring him the way she measured the household accounts, looking for what was actually there, not what was supposed to be there. "Thank you," she said. "Blackwell and I have been discussing it." "I can see that." She returned to the ledger. Edmund stood in the doorway a moment longer, then withdrew. He went to his study. He sat at his desk. He looked at the wall between the study and the morning room, the same thin plaster, the same inadequate construction, and he thought about the fact that his wife was on the other side of it, solving problems he had failed to solve, building a life he had not been invited into, and doing all of it with a competence that he had never suspected, because he had never looked. He tried the connecting door that night. It was locked. He stood with his hand on the handle, and he felt the lock's resistance, and he understood, with a clarity that arrived like cold water, what it meant. It meant she had heard. It meant she knew. It meant that she is nothing to me had passed through the dining room wall the way sound passes through muslin, not clearly, not completely, but enough. He did not knock. He was not ready to knock. Knocking required having something to say, and he did not yet know what that was, because the truth, the actual truth, the one he was only now beginning to assemble from the evidence of the past 5 weeks, was more complicated than anything he had ever said to his mother over dinner. The truth was that Helena was not nothing. Helena was, in fact, the most interesting thing in his house. She had simply been so quiet about it that he had mistaken her silence for absence, the way one mistakes a still lake for an empty one and does not think to look beneath the surface. Christmas came. Helena organized the tenants' dinner, a tradition that had lapsed since the old Duke's death. She arranged it herself with Mrs. Paget and the cook, and she invited every family on the estate. And she stood at the door of the great hall and greeted each one by name, because she had spent 5 weeks learning their names and their children's names, and which families needed firewood, and which needed the physician, and which simply needed someone to ask how they were. Edmund attended the dinner. He sat at the head of the table and watched his wife move through the room, not performing hospitality, but practicing it, with the genuine, unself-conscious warmth of a woman who had discovered that she was good at caring for people and had decided to do it whether anyone noticed or not. The Hendersons came. Their roof had been repaired. Mrs. Henderson held Helena's hands and said, "God bless you, Your Grace. The children can sleep dry now." And Helena said, "The children should always sleep dry, Mrs. Henderson. That is not a blessing. It is a minimum." And Edmund, hearing this from 3 seats away, felt something shift in his chest, not the dramatic upheaval of novels, but the quiet, structural adjustment of a foundation that had been sitting on the wrong ground and had just found solid earth. After the dinner, after the tenants had gone home and the great hall had been cleared and the house was quiet, Edmund went to the connecting door. He stood on his side. He raised his hand. He knocked. There was a long silence. "Yes?" Helena's voice through the door. "May I speak with you?" Another silence. Then the sound of the lock turning, not quickly, not eagerly, but with the deliberate pace of a woman who was choosing to open the door rather than being compelled to. She stood in the doorway in her nightgown, a shawl around her shoulders, her fair hair unpinned for the evening. She looked at him with the same assessing expression she had given him in the morning room, the look of a woman who measured things accurately and did not round up for comfort. "I heard what you said," she told him, "in November, through the wall. I heard you tell your mother that I am nothing to you." Edmund did not deny it. He did not explain it. He did not offer the context, his exhaustion, his mother's persistence, the path of least resistance that had governed every conversation he had ever had at that dining table. "I know," he said. "I have known for 5 weeks. Not because you told me, but because everything you have done since that night has been the response of a woman who heard something that broke something and who decided to build her own house inside mine rather than live in the ruins." Helena's hands tightened on her shawl, but her face did not change. "You took the morning room because the light is honest, and you needed honest light. You took the kitchen garden because it was neglected, and you do not tolerate neglect. You took the household accounts because they were wrong, and you cannot leave wrong things unfixed. You locked this door because a woman who is nothing to her husband does not owe him the intimacy of an unlocked door." He paused. "Everything you have done has been rational and correct, and I have watched all of it, and I have understood too late that the woman I called nothing is the most remarkable person in this house." Helena looked at him for a long time. The connecting door stood open between them, the oak and iron that had separated them for 5 weeks, the physical manifestation of 5 words spoken through a wall. "You said I was nothing," she said. "You said it to your mother while I sat on the other side of a wall reading a book I had been enjoying, drinking tea I had made myself because I did not want to trouble the kitchen in a room I had been given because it was the smallest and the least important and the farthest from anywhere you might actually be. You said I was nothing, and the worst part, the very worst part, is that you did not say it with cruelty. You said it with indifference, as though it were simply true, as though it were not even worth the energy of being unkind about. I know. Indifference is worse than cruelty. Cruelty requires attention. You did not even give me that. I know. And now you are here. Because the tenants' dinner impressed you. Because the drainage solution was clever. Because you have noticed, 5 weeks too late, that your furniture has opinions and your nothing has a mind. I am here, Edmund said, because I was wrong. Not mistaken. Wrong. There is a difference. A mistake is an error of information. Being wrong is an error of character. I did not lack information about you. I lacked the willingness to look, and I am not asking you to forgive that. I'm asking you to leave the door open and let me begin. Helena stood in the doorway, the shawl around her shoulders, the honest light, not the morning room's winter light, but the warmer light of candles, which was forgiving in ways that morning light was not, and which made the space between them look smaller than it was. I will leave the door open, she said, but you will earn the right to walk through it. The morning room is mine. The kitchen garden is mine. The household accounts are mine. The tenants know my name. If you want to know me, you will begin where they began, by paying attention. I will. We shall see. She did not close the door. She left it open, not as an invitation, but as a test, the way she left everything now, precise, deliberate, with consequences attached. Edmund stood on his side of the threshold and looked at his wife, this woman he had married without seeing, dismissed without knowing, and lost without understanding that he had ever had her. And he thought, she is right. She has been right about everything. The morning room and the kitchen garden and the drainage channel and the tenant's roof and the coal supplier and the lock on the door. She has been right about all of it, and I have been wrong, and the only thing left to do is what she said. Pay attention. He began the next morning. He came to the morning room at 7. She was already there. She was always already there. And she looked up from her desk with the composed expression that he was learning to read differently now, not as pleasantness, but as patience, not as compliance, but as the careful, calibrated withholding of a woman who would show herself only to someone who had demonstrated the willingness to look. Good morning, he said. Good morning, she said. He sat in the chair by the window. She returned to her ledger. The morning light, cold, clear, honest, fell across them both, and the silence between them was not the silence of indifference. It was the silence of beginning. The weeks that followed were not redemption. They were education. Edmund came to the morning room every day. He did not speak unless she spoke first. He had learned through 5 weeks of watching her lock a door and build a world without him that his voice was not the thing she needed. His presence was. His attention was. His willingness to sit in a room with her and watch her work and learn the shape of her mind, that was what she required. And he gave it day after day with the patient determination of a man who had been taught by the House of Lords that the most important skill in England was knowing when to listen. He learned. He learned that she was funny, dry, precise, devastating, and that the humor had been buried beneath 3 months of pleasant silence the way the kitchen garden had been buried beneath 3 years of neglect. He learned that she read voraciously and remembered everything and had opinions about land management that were better than Blackwell's. He learned that she wrote letters to her younger sister every week, long, detailed, affectionate letters that she sealed with wax and sent without telling anyone, and that her sister wrote back in a hand so similar to Helena's that the letters looked like conversations with herself. He learned that she had heard him through the wall and had not wept, that she had made a list, that the list had been the scaffolding for a new life built in 5 weeks from the ruins of 5 words. In February, he asked if he might walk the kitchen garden with her. She considered this for a moment, the same assessment, the same measuring, and she said, "You may, but you will need to learn the names of what is growing." He learned the names: rosemary, thyme, sage, the lavender she had pruned back to the wood, the mint she had contained, the new beds she had planted with varieties she had ordered from a nursery in London. He learned that she spoke to the plants, not in the way of eccentrics, but in the way of someone who understood that attention was a form of care, and that care directed at anything living produced results. In March, she unlocked the connecting door. She did not announce it. She did not make a ceremony of it. He discovered it on a Tuesday evening when he reached for the handle out of habit, a habit he had developed, reaching for the locked handle every night, feeling the resistance, accepting it, and the door opened. He stood in the open doorway. She was in bed, reading. She looked up at him over the top of her book. "The door's open," he said. "I'm aware." "Does this mean—" "It means the door's open. What you do with that information is your decision." He stepped through. He sat on the edge of the bed. He looked at her, his wife, the woman he had called nothing, the woman who had heard it through the wall and responded not with tears but with a list. And he said, "Helena, Edmund, you are not nothing." "I know," she said. "I have always known. You are the one who needed to learn it." The Dowager had been watching the transformation with the particular discomfort of a woman who understood that power was shifting and could not identify the mechanism. Her son was in the morning room at 7. Her son was walking the kitchen garden. Her son was attending tenants' meetings and asking Helena, not his mother, not Blackwell, about drainage and coal suppliers and which families needed the physician. She came to the morning room on a morning in March, uninvited, and found them together, Helena at the desk, Edmund in the window chair, a silence between them that was not the silence of strangers, but the silence of two people who had learned to occupy the same space without performing. "You have changed," the Dowager said to Edmund. "I have. She has changed you. She has shown me what was already here. I was not looking." The Dowager looked at Helena. Helena looked back at the Dowager with the composed, pleasant expression that had won the Dowager's approval a year ago. The same expression, the same face, but the woman behind it was no longer the woman the Dowager had selected. The woman behind it had heard 5 words through a wall and built an entire life in response, and that life was now so thoroughly established that the Dowager's authority had not been challenged or overthrown, but simply rendered unnecessary. "You were not what I expected," the Dowager said. "No," Helena said. "I was what you chose. The difference is that you did not look closely enough at what you were choosing." The Dowager opened her mouth. She closed it. She turned and left the morning room, and in the corridor she stopped and stood very still for a moment, in the way that people stand still when they are revising not just their assessment of a situation, but their assessment of themselves. She had chosen Helena for compliance. She had received a woman who had been compliant because no one had given her a reason to be anything else, and who, when given the reason, 5 words, a thin wall, a cup of tea gone cold, had become something the Dowager had not accounted for. A duchess. She retired to the Dower House in April. She did not frame it as defeat, she was too intelligent for that, but as a natural transition, which was the phrase she used to Lady Whitfield, who had originally recommended Helena with the specific endorsement, "She will give you no trouble." "She gave me no trouble," the Dowager told Lady Whitfield, over tea in the Dower House drawing room. "She gave me something considerably more inconvenient. She gave me a daughter-in-law who is better at running the estate than I am. It is very difficult to object to competence, Harriet. One simply has to admire it and get out of the way." Their daughter was born the following winter. They named her after Helena's mother, Charlotte, and on the morning after the birth, Mrs. Paget brought tea to the morning room, where Edmund was sitting in the chair by the window holding the baby, while Helena slept in the bedchamber next door with the connecting door open. And Mrs. Paget looked at the Duke holding his daughter in the cold, honest light and said, "The Duchess changed this house, Your Grace." "She did. She changed you as well, if I may say so." "You may," she would say, "you must." Mrs. Paget smiled, a rare event noted by the kitchen staff when she returned downstairs, and she left the morning room. Helena's sister visited that spring. Her name was Lucy, and she was 19, and she arrived at Ashworth Hall with 2 trunks and the wide-eyed astonishment of a girl who had grown up in a house where money was counted by the shilling and was now standing in a hallway that contained more silver than her father's entire estate was worth. She found Helena in the morning room, of course in the morning room, and she sat in the window chair that Edmund had claimed, and she said, "You are different." "Am I?" "You are. Larger. Not physically. But you fill this room. You fill this house. At home, you were always the one who made herself small. Father said you were the agreeable one. Mother said you were the easy one. I always knew you were neither of those things. I just didn't know what you were instead. Helena looked at her sister. She thought about the wall, the thin plaster, the 5 words, the list she had made that night, the household accounts, the tenants, the library, the kitchen garden, the morning room, the connecting door. She thought about how close she had come to responding differently, to crying, to confronting, to packing a trunk and returning to Hampshire, where she would have been the agreeable daughter again, the easy one, the one who made herself small because the alternative was too frightening. I am the same person, Helena said. I simply stopped making myself small. What changed? Helena considered telling her sister about the wall, about the words, about the night she made a list instead of weeping. She decided against it, not because it was a secret, but because the story, reduced to its facts, sounded like a story about a cruel husband and a wounded wife, and that was not what it was. It was a story about a woman who had been given no reason to expand until the moment she was given every reason, and who had discovered, in the space between a locked door and an open one, that she had been carrying the capacity for an extraordinary life inside a pleasant, compliant, nothing-shaped container, and that all it had taken to release it was a thin wall and the truth. Everything changed, she said, and nothing changed. I simply opened a door. Edmund sat in the honest light with his daughter and listened to the silence of the house, which was not the silence of indifference, but the silence of a place that had been rebuilt, room, by a woman who had heard the worst thing her husband could say and had responded with a list and a lock and a life so complete that when he finally came to the door, she could open it from a position of strength rather than need. If this story stayed with you, you might find the next one does too. They arrive here like a door unlocked from the inside, whenever they are ready.